Hey guys, it's Adam Harvey here. Hope you're all doing really well. I'm putting this video up today. It's kind of been a request, really. It's a walkthrough of a piece of music I wrote probably about a year and a quarter ago, when I first got Spitfire Audio's Albion Neo. And I wrote this piece of music as a sort of test demo for myself, because whenever I get a new sample library, I like to try and write a piece of music with it just to delve into it, get my hands dirty, figure out how the library works and how it might integrate with the rest of my setup. So I wrote this piece, put it online. I had a couple of comments from people just asking, could I go into a bit of detail about how I wrote the piece and how I used Albion Neo to create the different sounds and textures. So I thought I'd make that video today and go through this piece that I titled Find Her. It's sort of supposed to sound like a piece of contemporary thriller drama underscore, pretty simple, pretty droney, pretty straightforward, but a lot of kind of textural elements to it. So what this won't be is a compositional walkthrough. I mean, it's a really simple piece of music, so there's not a lot to say really compositionally. Very straightforward structurally and harmonically, little to no real melody about it. So what I have done is I made a link to the MIDI for this project in the description below, so you guys can download that and check that out if you do want to see sort of how it was put together and how I used the various expression data and so on to shape the piece. That's all available for you, but I'm going to just use this video to focus more on the kinds of sounds that I used and how I used Albion Neo to kind of create the textures and soundscape, rather than focusing too much on the composition because it's just so simple. So what I'll do is I'll go through the piece of music, I'll play it through from beginning to end, and then we'll just go through patch by patch. And then I did do a quick mix on this. I mean, mix is a bit of a strong word. It's really just quick balance and sort of ironed some instruments out and made it sound a bit more like I wanted it to. But I will go through that process too, just so you guys can see how I sort of manipulated the sounds to, make it sound like I wanted it to. But disclaimer, I'm not a mix engineer. I'm not a seasoned mixer. I do mix my own music, but it's just kind of what I did. So don't take it as a kind of mix tutorial. Just take it as me going through my process, basically. So this was written using Albion Neo and a couple of the Spitfire Audio free labs instruments too. And I won't go into too much detail about Albion Neo because there's plenty online about it, including on Spitfire's website. But basically, it's a kind of small contemporary chamber orchestra sound with a lot of interesting sort of textures and soundscapes and loops and pads and things added over the top of it. Albion have done a whole range of Spitfire have done a whole range of Albion sample libraries, and each one is essentially kind of orchestral ensemble patches, but each one has a slightly different style and approach and tone. And Albion, the best way I can describe it is I think there's been, over the last decade or so, a real kind of wave of, I guess, what you would call Scandinavian or Scandi composers that have come into major film and TV scoring and have produced a lot of amazing work, creating these really kind of dark, ethereal, atmospheric, quote unquote Scandi sort of sounding pieces of music. You can talk about composers like Olaf Arnolds or I guess the late great Johan Johansson, those kind of people that have done a lot of great work. And Neo is essentially a kind of toolkit of sounds and textures and ensemble patches that you would expect or could expect to find in that kind of musical, genre. So that's really what Albion Neo is aimed at, is people that, want those kind of cold, ethereal, atmospheric, haunting textures and orchestral sounds. So what I'll do is just play through this, and then we'll go through patch by patch and see how I put it together. So here is the track. So there we have it. That's the piece of music, all pretty simple. This is just the MIDI, so it's not really been mixed or anything here. I've added a bunch of reverbs at the tracking stage just to get a feel for it, but we'll go through that in more detail in the mix. So yeah, let's just go through sort of all the patches here and see how we used it. First of all, I used loops as sort of the foundation of this piece of music. All the Albion libraries, including Neo, come with a set of loops called Brunel loops, and I don't usually use loops, but you know, I wanted to write something quickly and I didn't want to check out the full range of the library, so I thought I'll try, you know, some of these loops and see what they sound like. And I ended up stumbling upon this Caught in the Reeds, and the great thing about these loops is that they are all basically broken up into, you know, they're tempo synced, so you can obviously, you know, change the tempo of them, and they're all broken up into various different sort of sections, so percussion, synth, bass synth, you know, low synth, high synth, guitars, that kind of thing. So the foundation of this piece is this Caught in the Reeds, and I used a couple of layers. I used this sort of percussion layer, so there's a hi-hat there, and then there's quite a lot of tonal materials, weird undulating strings and stuff. I didn't really need them for the context of this mix, but they were obviously inside of the loop, so they have to be in there. And they do provide some kind of ambience and sort of texture to it. But the real focus of this is these hi-hats. And then here I think I've had an extra layer, but it's doing the same thing basically. So that's the rhythmic element, and then that's combined with a guitar that's kind of playing a very similar rhythm. So just this kind of really simple guitar, and then the guitar, as we get into the middle of the section, it takes on essentially the kind of chord or harmonic element of the music. So you can hear what that's doing. It's basically providing that main, you know, harmonic sort of chord section, and then we have a bass. There's another bass loop called Caught in the Reeds. You know, it's the bass element of this, and it sounds like this. Really nice, sort of dark, warm, meandering, sort of plodding bass. So those three together, which they're all from the same sort of loop patch, provide most of the sort of foundation of the piece. Really interesting, sort of quite ambivalent sounding rhythm section. The only things going on at the beginning, we have the Neo orchestra split into A and B strings. So essentially two small string sections. And I'm just using the B strings here. And I think they're set to pizzicatos. Here they are. Yep, and they're set to pizzicatos. And in the beginning of this piece, for the first four repetitions of the phrase, it's just plucking. They're really not doing that much. In fact, probably when I was tracking this, I was doing it so fast, it only took me an hour or so that I probably just chucked these in and decided, they're not doing anything, and didn't follow them through for the rest of the track, but they help with just that first intro. And they are being combined with a free Labs instrument, the Opia sub bass. Love the sound of this. Just such a huge sounding sort of analog bass, and that's just playing sort of the first beat, I guess, of each sort of repetition of the phrase, just providing something really heavy to sort of augment the beginning of each phrase. So that's really all that's doing. So you can just see if I combine that with the bass and the rhythm. Just providing this kind of punctuation point, I guess. And that's most of what's going on there with the kind of bass elements. The next thing that I wanted to add was these kind of almost like a horn or a kind of call. It's just something really weird sounding going on at the beginning of each phrase. So I found a patch called War Horns, and I mean, that's always going to pique your interest, isn't it? A patch called War Horns, and lo and behold, it sounds pretty great. It's just one of these patches here that goes through the Spitfire Audio eDNA engine. So essentially it's patches from the orchestral part of the library that have just kind of been mangled and shaped and redesigned to create these really interesting textures. And then you can do further augmentation with envelopes and you can mix the kind of two elements together. You can do gates and all kinds of other stuff. It just really helps you create quite unique sounds. As it is, I think this is pretty much just the preset with a bunch of reverb added, and maybe I've changed some of this slightly, because you can see I can oscillate, mix between essentially the two oscillators. I'm just using this side. So that's creating that drone. I'm just using the mod wheel to shape that. And then I'm adding another patch here called Valhalla in octaves. Just really adding a lot of kind of bassy sub, really intense low end there. Then two higher patches, one called Frozen Lake, which is this very kind of fragile higher string section. Just adding a bit of top end, and then one called Mirage, and this is sort of a woodwind patch that's been mangled and redesigned. It's filling out that frequency spectrum, adding some of the really unsettling detuned element to it, all four of them together. So we'll just move on to the strings and the harmonium. Now the harmonium is one of the sort of featured instruments in the Albion Neo library. Sounds great, just perfect for this style of music. Very haunting, kind of cold, fragile texture. Just sounds beautiful. Such a perfect texture for this kind of music, and that's just being used to support the guitar chords essentially. So those chords we heard earlier on, the harmonium's just playing them in these kind of sustained parts. So you get the idea there. And then we've got two strings. For some reason I use the A strings on both of these. I don't really know why. But you have these high strings here. If I just move these, show you them. They're playing long, slow D tunes. Albion comes with the really great, quite kind of unique set of articulations. A lot of these you wouldn't normally get. You've got all the usual ones like longs, legatos, pizzicatos, shorts, that kind of thing. But you also have these really interesting ones like this long, slow D tune. Really beautiful textures there. So they're just supporting the harmonium and the guitar. They're all doing similar kinds of things. And then we've got another texture here. This is the strings again. These are playing, I believe, the flautandos. Yep. So flautando is one of those lesser sampled articulations, should we say, but Spitfire include them in quite a lot of their orchestral libraries, and this one's no different. Just a beautiful, it's an even more airy kind of fragile texture. And these are being played with a kind of rhythmic pulse, which just gives them a lot of extra movement, because this kind of music is associated with often quite simplistic or repetitive or quite drony sort of elements. So you want a lot of movement in the patches to continue to keep kind of sonic interest. And pretty much, a lot of these sort of pads and string, articulations have a lot of that great movement and undulation in them that you need. So the strings together, these three, sound like this with the harmonium. And that's pretty much everything apart from this piano and this Hackney Angels. I'll go to the piano first and show you very quickly. It's kind of providing essentially a slightly more transient repetition. You know, it's basically copying the guitar, but it's slightly more transient because of the kind of pluck of the piano, I guess, as the hammer hits the string. Sounds really nice. And this is just the Lab soft piano, free instrument again, sounds brilliant. Really beautiful. Yep, so that's just kind of providing more rhythm alongside the guitar loop. And that's pretty much it. The only thing we've got here are these Hackney Angels. And honestly, these are just providing the tail to these kind of horn sections. So if I just show you, actually I'll show you in isolation first. It's a very, very sort of simple ambient sound. Really not doing a lot. Again, these are free from the Lab series. And this is just the London Atmos. So really simple pad, but I just felt you needed something to sustain the back end of these horns, so they sort of play, and then you'll hear this kind of coming in the back end. That's really all they're doing. And then if we just go to the outro of this piece, there's just a couple of extra things to show you. I used two more of the Spitfire Neo sort of pad sounds. This is one called Lost in the Blinding Whiteness. Sounds like this. So you can see it's just another of these going through the eDNA engine. This one's programmed in with some more undulation to give it more movement, and you can hear the Albion woodwind section is kind of different to a symphonic one. It's a more contemporary one, so I think got saxophones, slightly different measure of instruments, just a lot kind of warmer sound than a traditional sort of symphony orchestra that would have more, you know, bassoons and oboes and you know, flutes and sort of a lot more going on. This is a lot warmer and kind of more in the mid-range, I guess. So yeah, there's that one, and then there's this Space Glitter. Kind of tremolo, you know, kind of sound, and that kind of sounds a bit weird on its own, but combined with this one, it just kind of helps create some sonic movement. That's really all they're doing. They're supported by the piano doing the same thing with these low drone notes. The piano's being plucked sort of quite, you know, quite short there, really kind of just being hit quite staccato. Kind of sounds a bit weird on its own, but it does sort of help provide some transient attack for those sections. And then as I was composing, the only thing I thought that we were really missing was something sort of higher transient, something to just bring a bit more sonic interest higher up the frequency. So I used another free instrument, one of my favorites from Labs, the dulcimer. Beautiful. This is the fingered articulation. There's a few more on there as well. They all sound great, and this is just doing the same thing, but sort of providing a slightly sharper transient with the piano. With everything. Just really interesting textures, you know. Crits is really kind of quite unsettling sounding instrument in a way, you know, playing these little kind of chord sections here. And that's pretty much everything. There's really nothing else going on, to be honest, guys. I mean, we've got a few of these sort of droning along in the background. So these are just undulating in the background, creating some continuing movement to this whole outro section. But that is it for the track, guys. Just play a little bit of the outro on its own. Yeah, so you get the idea. And then I wrote that probably in about, I don't know, an hour or so, because you can see it's a lot. It's just a lot of simple ideas that have been repeated and just expanded upon a bit, and then an outro kind of added on to the end. It just helped me just to get a feel for how the library worked and the kind of patches we had, and the kind of sound design elements that were in there to play with as well. And then all I did, was export all that out and mix it slightly. And as I say, I'm not a mixer, so mix is a strong word, but just sort of did what I wanted to do to get the sound where I wanted it roughly. And this is the sort of mixed version, if you like. So yeah, sounds quite a lot bigger than the sort of MIDI output, but I'll sort of go between the two so you can see. So you get the idea, kind of what I did, but I'll just go through maybe not every track, but a few of these tracks and just show you some of the key things that I did here. Most of it was just cleaning up some unwanted resonances and, cleaning up some low-end mud and things that we didn't need, and some, low-end sort of Hartman stuff, So I'll go through and just show you really quickly some of the more interesting tracks from here. So let's take this one. This is the bass, or one of the main basses. So that's that bass loop that we were using, and this is it without any of the EQ. And with. So you can see it's really just squashing stuff down. I'll show you what I did sort of blow by blow here. So the first thing I did was just shape the track a bit, just basically cutting out some of the real heavy low stuff down here in the subs and shaping some of the bass and mids here. Then the second EQ, I've actually got two EQs on. This is really just cutting everything that we don't need out of it. So some of this low again, and a lot of the high, because there was some stuff going on up there. If I just show you. So this is with the second EQ. And this is without. So really just using that to shape. And then the next thing going on is a little bit of one of my favorite plugins, Decapitator. There's actually not much at all going on here, just a tiny bit of saturation, lowering the tone a bit. Decapitator is a kind of saturator distortion plugin, but really good, very musical, sounds great. And I'm just using that. If I just show you, it just kind of compresses and fattens the sound a little bit, makes it a bit more even, just adds something to it really nice. So here's with. Without. Yeah, just adding something to it. And the final sort of secret sauce here, if you like, is low air. This is a Waves plugin, and basically this is a sub-harmonic generator. So this is kind of synthesizing low frequencies to give a lot of that kind of cinematic sub-element that might have been missing. I mean, what's kind of funny about this, but it seems counterintuitive, but it works sometimes, is that I'm removing a lot of the actual bass here, or lowering it down, because some of it was just sort of too much or not really what I wanted, but I'm introducing a lot of essentially artificial sub-harmonics. But that can sometimes work, because these sub-harmonics, to my knowledge, are generated from the higher harmonics and then, kind of translated lower. So you're getting something different to what you would get if you just left, no EQ on it. I'll try and show you a bit with and without. So here is with the low air. Without. With. without. So there's a lot going on in the very low end, probably, to be completely honest with you, probably a bit too much. So I'll bring that back a tiny bit. And I haven't really gain staged these properly, guys. So don't look at this as a mix tutorial, because, you know, if you're really looking to mix properly, you'd spend a lot more time gain staging stuff and making sure that everything was coming in and out of plugins at the right levels. I just sort of did this quick just to get something that sounded okay, you know. But yeah, that's basically what I did, just to sort of fatten that bass up and make it more consistent and even in the mix. And you can hear it does just sort of squash it a bit and make it more of a bed from which the rest of the instruments can kind of come out from. To that, we've got the sub bass pluck, the Opia sub bass. Really not a lot going on here, just there's a bit of high end in this that was a bit unnecessary, because we've got strings and things going on up here, and a tiny bit of very low end that we didn't need, so that's just been shaped a bit. And then a bit of decapitated, a little bit more this time, not really using the tone, but using the drive a bit. And I'll just show you with and without. Again, decapitator is just going to kind of fatten it and squash it a little bit and make it sound a bit more pleasant. So without decapitator, sounds pretty good still, but with, just sort of squashes it slightly and helps it sit in the mix a bit better. So that's all I've really done there. I'll just go through some more of these a bit quicker. This is just a utility gain tool, so I just use this to bring things roughly where I think they need to be in the gain stage to get them to work right. And then it's going through a neutron. As I said earlier on, I didn't really want a lot of the tonal string elements of this, so I've removed a lot of the sort of unnecessary stuff here and in the mids and just accentuated the highs a bit here. With ATQ. With. So you can see just taking out stuff that basically doesn't need to be there because there's other instruments in the frequency spectrum doing jobs there, and accentuating what does need to be there, which is the hi-hat and some of the rhythm. It's as simple as that, really. The guitars. Let's see, so I haven't done a huge amount here, but what I have done is pretty much everything that doesn't need some of this really low end is gone, because you can, you know, there's so much bass in this that you don't need any other bass that you don't need, basically. So that's gone. And then because there's quite a lot of strings and those kind of horn sounds up in this range here, you know, especially up here, you just don't need that in the guitar. It's just sort of cluttering things up and providing a lot of hiss and air that you don't need. So I'll show you. With the EQ, as you can see, here's really where the instrument lies. Without the EQ, bit of hiss and sort of air that we don't need. So yeah, in the context of this particular track, a lot of that was redundant because the strings up there, so out it goes. So I'll just go to the strings briefly now and the harmonium. Won't go through these in too much detail because there's not that much to say, really. Harmonium, mud's gone, the bass is gone, and a little bit of this sort of, you'll often find things build up around here because a lot of instruments live in this sort of area, and it can sound particularly muddy in this sort of 200 to 500 area here. So when you're shaping the sound, sometimes you just don't want too much living there, and that's the case here. So with the EQ, without, can you hear her? It just adds a lot of that's just too much to be living in a mix. That's a little bit better. So that's all I'm really doing there. I'm also the strings. So these are the high strings. Low ends being cut, not needed. The only thing that's really worth talking about here, two things you'll often find that you do with strings, not always, but often. Number one, in the 1 to 3K range, strings can often sound a bit nasally. It's an important frequency range, but strings can be particularly kind of biting there. Sometimes you just don't want quite as much as you've got. So this is probably a good example. I show you that frequency range. Can you hear how it's just, it's not great, and too much of it really sort of cuts through. I mean, I'll show you if I boost it. Just not good. Even up here, not good, really. Just taking a bit out often softens the strings and places them in the track a bit better. But sometimes you do often want a bit of air, you know, between sort of above 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever. This one's just 6.5. Basically, I'm just boosting by 0.7 of a dB. So it's not doing a lot, but it's just adding something airy and kind of to that top end, you know, where you get a lot of the kind of presence. That's really what's going on there for the lower strings. I'll come to the frozen strings in a minute, but for these slightly lower strings, same sort of thing, taking slightly lower down a little bit out there because obviously they're playing slightly lower down, so the frequency spectrum is a bit different. Also taking out some of the air from here. I know it seems a bit counterintuitive to add air in one set of strings and take it out of the other, but the reason being this is doing so much because it's got this really nice sort of high sound. You just don't need that air here, and I'll show you what I mean. So here's with the EQ. If I reintroduce the high elements, see how you just don't really need that top end happening in those particular strings. Now the frozen strings I added, these are MIDI, again free labs, sound great. As I was sort of mixing the track, I just realized I thought that there was something droney missing from the middle of the track. It sounded a bit sparse. So without the frozen strings, it sounds like this. It's fine, but I felt like it was missing a texture with the frozen strings. I'm going to play it, and you're going to probably hear like it doesn't really sound any different. Then I'll mute the frozen strings, and you'll see what I mean. Particularly here in this part. Here, particularly at the end of those phrases, there's just something a little bit lifeless, and those frozen strings just help to keep a texture going, so that's why they're there. Haven't done a huge amount to those. Well, I've kind of taken out some of the mids, boosted some of the highs, obviously taken out some of the extreme lows here. So and what I've done in particular here, because these are really just providing a drone element, I've used a stock Cubase multi-band compressor just to really bring up and squash those kind of lower elements. So you'll really hear this makes a difference. Seems quite extreme, but you know, this is not being used as real strings in a way. This is being used as a kind of undulating pad texture. So what we really want from this is, you know, certainly the first 500 hertz up to like sort of 1.5. We don't really need as much of this, which is why it's been ducked out a bit. We have a lot of that from the upper strings. We're really focusing on just adding extra warmth and sort of extra texture in this middle area. So yeah, pretty extreme, but it does work in the context of the mix. And I think that's pretty much everything. We'll very quickly go through these war horn elements. We're not doing a huge amount to these. We're probably just cutting out a bit of bass. Let's have a look. So where are they? There we go. Yeah, cutting out a bit of the bass and lower end. We're accentuating, you know, we've talked about that nasally quality here, but if you think about it, these instruments are designed to be quite obnoxious in the context of the mix. You know, you really need to hear them, and kind of they're creating the unsettling quality to this particular track. So in a way, you want that area to be boosted here. And I'll just show you what I mean. I'll solo the war horn and do with and without EQ. You just want it to be kind of poking out in the mix more. So that's what that's doing there, and pretty much the same with the rest of these as well. You know, we're actually doing something a bit different here. I mean, this is providing the low end of those horns, so what the EQ is doing really is just reducing some of that bass, which is a bit intense. and cutting a frequency here that is obviously just obnoxious as I was mixing. Yeah, it's just a lot of fizz there that we don't need, especially because we got that war horn sort of in that area doing that. And then the sort of slightly more textural sections. There's not going to be a lot going on here. Let's take a quick look. Yeah, just cutting out mud, a couple of frequencies that are not very relevant. Probably the same here. Yeah, exactly the same. Adding a tiny bit of air because this frozen lake is what is important about this. You can hear it there. All pretty straightforward there. I think that's about it for those. The London Atmos, which is the tail of these war horns, I was using it as the tail if you remember, I actually did a fair bit to this because by the time I mixed everything, these were just sounding quite weedy. I mean, I'll show you if I take everything off. It's not adding much. So what I did was add an R bass, which is another subharmonic generator, but slightly different. But this is generating frequencies range 60 Hertz, quite intense. And then a neutron to just shape it a bit, take some of the extreme lows off and shelve some of the highs as well. But it's making quite a difference. I mean, I'll show you on its own. Here's without and with. It's really adding some of that kind of low weight. So synthesizing quite a lot of that stuff down there, but it was just necessary. By the time everything was mixed, it just didn't have enough going on. So with the weight added, you can really feel that in the mix now. Whereas beforehand, nothing there, something there, nothing there, something there, basically. So that's what I did, just to sort of bring that into the mix a bit more. And that's about it. We've got, in the end section, we've got these synths. All that's really happening here, I imagine, is we're accentuating, yeah, basically just accentuating these mids, taking some of these highs out, or sort of low mids, I guess, because that's where the instrument lives, you can see. So we really want that texture to be coming through. Show you just balancing it, basically making sure it sits in the context of the mix of a whole, because it's not a bright mix, so you don't need a lot of that top end stuff. Probably the same here. Yeah, pretty much exactly the same. Cutting out all this stuff, cutting out some of the air, boosting where the instrument lives. Really easy. Here I've got the soft piano. Actually, I don't think we've covered the soft piano, so let's do that really quickly. Utility gain, nothing. Nothing here really. Taking some of the air out, taking some of the low elements out, and then must be a sort of frequency here we didn't like. Doesn't sound too bad, but yeah, it's just kind of there just to tame something there that wasn't great. And then I've copied it over, and the only thing that I've done differently here is change the reverb. Adding another reverb here, and I'll just go through the reverbs really briefly. Basically, using 3, I come up here, there they are. So I'm using a Valhalla Room on the dark chamber mode, you know, fairly long decay. Well, yeah, I suppose it's fairly long. That's about it. And then I'm using a 7th Heaven plate, and I'm just using that on a couple of instruments to kind of place them in the mix a bit more. And then this one by Quantum Leap Spaces, which is the Planetary Manifestation. So this is almost like a special effects reverb, 14.4 second tail. So there's a lot going on there, and it has all kinds of crazy reflections and so on. But I'm using them pretty sparingly. You can see, I won't go through everything, but most instruments have a touch of the really long reverb. A few have a bit more, and a few have the plate just to put them in a more interesting sonic space as well. And the reason you can get away with using a really long reverb like this in this track is because it's a very drony track. You know, if this was a track that was modulating between D minor and F minor and all that kind of stuff, it wouldn't work. It would just sound really slurred and muddy and just horrible and out of tune. But because it's really just one long D sustained drone with things going on over the top of it, you can kind of get away with some of that. And I'll just maybe show you very quickly like one or two of these tracks. So if I just, this is the lost whiteness. So if I just, on its, sounds cool, but you know, it sort of needs to be almost saturated a bit by this reverb to really be sort of lost in the wilderness, if you like, or lost in the whiteness. But so that kind of reverb often wouldn't work, but in the context of this particular track, it does. There's not much else to talk about, guys. I mean, panning wise, I'm just panning things where I wanted them, basically. It's nothing that exciting. I don't think we covered the dulcimer, but to be honest, there's not a lot going on there. Gain just to use as a Unity tool. Sorry, not a Unity tool. Just as a tool to get where I wanted the gain to be. And then, so I'm doing a little bit here. The EQ is just basically taking it a bit of a frequency here, and some of the mud. This is just probably a harsh. Yeah, so maybe just a bit too sort of bright there. Didn't quite want as much of that. I'm using the transient shaper. If you listen to this, let's just bypass this. Just sounds a little bit too sharp. So I just used the transient shaper just to reduce some of the attack and increase some of the sustain and just even it out slightly whilst keeping those dynamics in place. And then the compressor is doing very, very little. I think it's just taming some of the slightly higher dynamics. It looks like it's doing barely anything, really. Yeah, it's just notching a tiny bit out here and there when it gets a bit too hot. Really very little. I think that's pretty much everything, guys. Yep, so that's the track. I think, there's just a tiny EQ on the master. I mean, it's not being mastered at all, but just taking some of that muddiness around 400, you know, there's often a build up 200 to 500, like we said, and just boosting a little bit of kind of presence here as well. And I think that probably just about wraps it up, guys. To be honest, I don't think there's much else to really see here. I think we've gone through most of the major stuff. And yeah, I just hope you found this useful. A little introduction to Albion Neo and how I used it to create this particular track. As I say, the MIDI will be in the description below, so if you do want to delve into it and sort of use it on your own DAWs to see how I came up with this piece and how I used Albion Neo, do so by all means. If you guys want to see any other sort of walkthroughs, tutorials, anything that you think that would be helpful to you guys, just let me know and I will endeavor to do my best to get them to you. If you want to like or subscribe, that will really help me and help me generate new content for you guys as well. So I think we will wrap it up here. Hopefully that was a good introduction to Albion Neo. It's a great library. I think it's really useful and I highly recommend it to people that need these kinds of textures and sounds in their template. That's all for now, guys. Thanks a lot for listening and watching, and see you soon.